as President Roosevelt stated. And so what we want to talk about today is the attack on Pearl Harbor, maybe what led up to it, some of the things behind it, what actually happened there. And you're welcome to call in and fill me in on anything I get wrong, or on if you feel my opinions are misspaced. But yeah, at 7 o'clock in the morning on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese fleet attacked our U.S. Navy and Army compounds on Hawaii, on the Big Island at Pearl Harbor, which is where we had a lot of our fleet stored. And the significance of that is the same as, I'm not going to say it's on the same level as 9/11, about the same amount of lives were lost, though. But I think there were things that led up to it and that could have been prevented, that we should have seen coming and should have been better protected. I think everyone, though an armchair quarterback, can say should have done this, should have done that, should have seen this, should have seen that. But what they say is if you don't study history, then you're doomed to repeat it. So you should learn some things that happened in history. And actually, when they talk about Pearl Harbor there, like, it wasn't just like a sneak attack like they decided on December 6th to have the fleet leave the Tokyo Bay and go out into the ocean and then show up mysteriously at Pearl Harbor December 7th. It was a long planning. In fact, they were at, they pretty much had this decided in November, because the fleet left. This was November 26th when the fleet left to head towards Pearl Harbor. The Japanese fleet was under radio silence. That means no one was communicating with them, so no one could intercept the codes and tell where they're at. There wasn't satellite imagery. There wasn't a cross-Pacific drones up there looking at anything. There was a wide Pacific Ocean, and they came through. So they were going for 2 weeks, approximately over 2 weeks before they hit Pearl Harbor. Well, no, just around under 2 weeks, because 30 days in November, under 2 weeks. So even if they had, it would have taken something for the Japanese government to have broken radio silence to turn that fleet around from the attack. So they had already planned that attack. Now, things people don't realize happened on the same day, although it's listed as December 8th, it's because it crossed the international date line. The Japanese also attacked the Philippines and also attacked Wake Island. So there was 3 coordinated attacks to include Pearl Harbor. So they were trying for a massive knockout blow on the fleet and to bring us into negotiations that would be beneficial to the Imperial Japan. So one of the things,
Mike, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Paul.
Hey, Mike, in looking at this, I found a couple of interesting things out, kind of touches on what you're talking about. It turns out that Yamamoto was at a conference in Washington, D.C. in 1925. And at that time, there was a book written by a British author, Hector Bywater, and it was called The Great Pacific War. And what happened was, no one knows for sure, but it looks like the Imperial Japanese Navy at the time had either several articles about the book or the book, in fact, translated. And they began to study. And in that book, it kind of indicates that the war would have started in 1931.
Yeah, the war started actually, the way the Chinese and the Japanese look back on it, the war actually started in 1931 when the Japanese invaded Manchuria. So that they dated that far back, So,
right.
So the Japanese.
And there's a really interesting fact that they didn't discover until 60 years later. It turns out that at 6:40 in the morning, the USS Ward was doing patrol in the harbor by Pearl Harbor, and they sighted a periscope, and they fired on it. And it turned out that they didn't know this, but they actually destroyed the midget sub and they didn't find that out. They knew they shot at something, but they didn't find that out until 60 years later, where the sub was discovered with a hole in it, and it's at the bottom of the harbor. And the whole attack only lasted from 7:55 in the morning to approximately 9:10. And then it was over by then. And you're right, they did attack. They also attacked Hong Kong and some other places. And their rationale behind this was for them to protect their resources. And they felt that they were being strangled in some way. So they struck out on this.
Well, one of the things that happened, if they date way back into let me see, I got some notes here, like in January 26th, 1941. So this is building. This is getting close to December 7th. There, January 26th, 1941. The Japanese had been at war with Vichy France. So France had already been defeated by the Germans, but the Japanese had entered into the tripartite act with Germany and with Italy.
Wasn't it?
What?
Okay.
All right,
Wasn't it Russia too?
It was Italy and Germany and Japan became the major Axis powers at that time, and they had the tripartite agreement that if it was kind of like NATO, if anyone that wasn't already involved in the war attacked one of the other parties, right, then the other parties would have to come to the assistance of that. So, like if the Americans who were not involved in the war at this time were still quasi-neutral, I could argue about there's no such thing as a neutral. If you stay you're neutral, you're benefiting one party over the other. It's that simple. So there's really no such thing as a neutral. You're trying to keep out of it is what it is, but you're still, you could benefit one party or the other. One party needs it more. All right, so if any power, like if we were to attack Japan for some reason, then that would have started the war earlier, because then Germany would have declared war on us and Italy would have declared war on us, right? So it wasn't until after the Japanese attacked us that the Germans came out and declared war, and we had declared war on Germany and on Japan at the same time. So, but what happened was since France had capitulated, there was still part of France that wasn't really messed up by the war that the Germans hadn't occupied, and they maintained a neutrality, quasi-neutrality under like the German guidelines, Vichy France, and they actually went to war with the Japanese in French Indochina, and the Japanese had occupied a bunch of the former French air bases in Indochina with the intention of blocking the British from from supporting to China, because Japan was at war with China since 1937. All right, and so so we said, listen, we don't want you having those air bases there. We don't want you being in the air bases. And we said, okay, we're going to freeze all your assets. Then later on, about 5 days later, that's when we blocked off oil and gasoline and our scrap steel. All right. So one of the things that I took into account with studying history and sort of military is you don't go to war with a trade partner. If you're having good trade with a country, mutual trade, good trade, not where it overly benefits one country over the other, a good trade partner, you're never going to go to war with them because it's just bad for both sides, which is the reason now, dating back to World War I, remember, the Japanese were our allies in World War I. Right? They were on our side. Right?
And so was Italy.
So was Italy, yes. So was Italy. And so when World War I breaks out, we have a large ethnic German population in the United States. Right? At one time, they were considering German as the national language. Right? So why do we go to war with Germany when we had never fought them before? I mean, we fought Hessians. Those were mercenaries hired by the British, right? But we had never been at war with Germany. And the British, our last official war with them was the War of 1812, but the British were very much on the side of the Confederacy, and they were buying the Confederate cotton, and they were supporting the Confederacy over the United States. in the Civil
They were
War.
providing them with rifles too,
Yeah.
the Confederates, with Enfield rifles.
So you look at that and you go, well, the British were really more aggressive towards us, less likely to be our ally, right, than the Germans would be. The British blockaded Germany, and we could not trade with the Germans. We could only trade with the British. So things came up with the with Mexico City, with the Germans trying to get the Mexicans to invade the United States to keep us from to open up a new front, so we're not supplying so much for the British. And then we entered the war, the Lusitania and everything, machinations on there. But I think the main reason we were fighting with the British at that time, not just the language, that we spoke the same language, was that they were a trade partner and Germany wasn't. So now what we did is we were a trade partner with the Japanese. We're trading them oil and gas, which we had in abundance through California, and we had refineries. Right? The Japanese didn't have this much. Right? They didn't have the oil pumping thing. They didn't have refineries. We had that established, and we had all the scrap steel. You know, Japan didn't have a lot of steel. China didn't have a lot of steel. I mean, you can mine iron ore and everything, but the United States had a lot of scrap steel that we were selling, and you don't have to do as much smelting when it comes to refining scrap steel as opposed to refining ore. So the Japanese needed that to continue to build their Pan-Asian empire. All right, so if they couldn't get it from us, there was no reason for them not to fight us and not to push us to the side. And I think their intention was one overbearing attack that so devastated us that we were going to come to the negotiating, you know, have a negotiated peace and then reestablish trade with them. Well, they didn't realize that, you know, with all the Japanese officers that came and were trained over here, like Yamamoto himself, right? He came over here, and they still didn't learn one thing, that you don't poke the sleeping bear. You know, I mean, Yamamoto's, the famous quote was, I'm afraid all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The reason being because they did not accomplish their mission at Pearl Harbor. They damaged us, they hurt us, they punched us pretty bad. It was kind of like a kidney punch, you know, oh my God, this is, you know, and we're gaining our breath. But they did not sink a ship in the entry to the harbor. One of the things they were hoping for was to sink something that was coming in or leaving the harbor and blocking that entrance for months and months and months before the rest of the battleships could get out. Basically, you know, taking all those battleships out of the war. And they were really hoping to get the aircraft carriers there because the Japanese probably were the first to realize we had the first aircraft carrier, the Lexington, or not, the Langley. The Langley, all right? So we had it first, but then like everything else, like VHS tapes, that was developed in the United States, CDs developed in the United States, all this, and then the Japanese perfected, right? So we have an aircraft carrier, and the Japanese realized, man, this is really good because you could really extend your power there, right? So they were hoping to catch our aircraft carriers at Pearl Harbor, and instead of the battleships, they would have went after the aircraft carriers. Then, without having to worry, they could conduct an air war from hundreds of miles away, and we couldn't strike back at them. They would just send aircraft. As long as they weren't sending it to an island, you know, they could, you know, destroy our ships from a distance way over the horizon before we could even get close to firing at them. So when they didn't destroy the aircraft carriers, when they didn't bottle us up at Pearl Harbor, they immediately lost the war. And Yamamoto knew that. You know, he knew it because he had actually seen our industrial might. We were kind of slowed down. Our industry had picked up a little bit to support the war in Europe, but now it just kicked into high gear. And if we had not had a Germany first policy, all right, if we had gone we had pushed our full force and might to the Japanese, we probably would have put them out of the war in late 43. So Every- So, yeah, so getting up on it, right? I think I jumped the gun there. But when you talk about that stuff like July 1937, so there was like a very iffy peace between China and the Japanese that occupied Manchuria. And it was on edge, sort of like we were always the Cold War in Berlin, right? So there was an incident at the Marco Polo Bridge in 37, and that re-erupted the hot war with China. So I think what we should have looked at there is, one, the Japanese need, what do you call it? They need the oil, they need the gas, they need rubber, the resources, right? So if China, I mean, it's kind of a little resource intensive, but, you know, they import the stuff and make a lot of stuff. You know, they use their labor as exports. So they build things and make it through cheap labor. They actually have to import most of their resources. So the Japanese go into the most resource-rich place in the world. They're going to go up north into Siberia. So they're on the border of Mongolia, all right, and they decide that they're going to go to war with Russia. And it was really like an undeclared war because it was so far in the east, right? But it was a bunch of battles that took place. And then later on in August the 9th, they started the war there on the 11th of May of 39, which we should have opened up our eyes and said, hey, listen, 39, the Russians are at war with the Japanese, right? And we should say the Japanese going to war with Mother Russia, huge Mother Russia, even before Germany had, right? That's a sign that they really kind of a little arrogance. Like, why wouldn't they attack us if they're going to attack Russia, who literally who has a border with Japan? All right, they're on an island there. They both have a border with it, and through Vladivostok, the Russians are a lot closer. But they're going up through Manchuria and through Mongolia, and then there's a major battle that's fought at Gakengol. All right, that's by the Gakengol River, and that was where Yuri Zhukov, famous for his defense of Stalingrad and his defeat of the German army there, right? He had organized this attack on the Japanese, or counterattack on the Japanese, and he spanked them, right? He really embarrassed them. The Japanese army was routed by the Russians. They took heavy casualties compared to Russian casualties, and they decide, hey, there's going to be like an unspoken treaty peace agreement. We're not going to fight with the Russians. We're not going to go to actual war with the Russians. The battle was over. But now the Japanese have lost face. They've lost a lot of face because their last victory was in 1905 over the Russo-Japanese War. But now they've lost this minor battle after they've been just handing it over to, they've been spanking the Chinese, I mean. They went into Korea, So now they've got to regain face, and they can't do it against Russia. It might be with an agreement with Germany and everything, because if Japan was going to go to war with Russia immediately, the Russian industrial might would have started going earlier in the war. All right, so that would have posed the threat, and you're giving the Russian army and their commanders time to sift out let the scum float to the surface, right? So the Russians could get rid of them, and then you have a more professional Russian army, and you move them back west, right? And then the Germans are facing something a little different. So now the Japanese have got to save face. They've been fighting with the British, but not really major fighting. The British are occupied in North Africa. They're occupied defending their home island. They're not really overextended. Yeah, they defeated the Vichy French a little bit, and there was a agreement that that stopped that. But they really hadn't had a major victory to save the face. And so America should have looked at and said, yeah, we're next, right? They're going to come after us next, because either they're going to try to take our resources, Alaska, the Philippines, which was a protectorate of us, and the
Hawaii.
Hawaii, yeah, that's a long way off, but the Philippines are much closer and they're protected. So we tried to bump up the Philippines a little bit, right? But not enough. We should have protected them even more. We had just started drafting the National Guard into active duty, and the Illinois National Guard was actually over there in the Philippines. But again, too little, too late. You got to put a heavy duty force there to prevent that attack. So in some ways, if you have a bank and you just leave the money outside of the vault, and you don't even have a armed guard there, or maybe you got an unarmed security guard, right? And he's supposed to prevent people from coming in and taking that money, it's not going to happen. So it's on the director of the bank that allowed it to happen, right? And so when you look at us, and I'm not forgiving the Japanese anything, right? But I think at the time, the politicians and the military, well, some of the military was like screaming, this is wrong, right? We need more support. MacArthur was not one of them. He had known that they would write off the Philippines. They already wrote off the Philippines in 1939, which is bad. It's bad. They should have just reinforced it. But who wants to draft? At that time, we were trying to be a isolationist country. So who wants to start up a massive draft and send all of our troops way overseas into the Pacific, to make a stand? And then people are going to say, well, we're not isolationists. We don't want to get into war. And then you have the next election come up and, oh, you're going to lose, right? So they're balancing it for political reasons. But then the same thing happens at Pearl Harbor there. All right, so we're going to take a break. All right, come back. We're going to discuss more on Pearl Harbor Day, which really isn't a holiday. It's a Remembrance Day like 9/11, which they call Patriots Day. So this is Chief Guard of the Republic Radio Show. See you back here on WRMN1410.com. WRMN, you can call us in if you want on the voice, 847-931-1410. And the text, 505-926-1410, or hit us up in the comments on Facebook Live, WRMN 1410 channel. If you can't pick us up outside of the 2,000-watt radio range, you can listen live on the WRMN app. Just go to WRMN1410.com and go to the Play Live. So I want to say hello to Brendan, the super fan of WRMN 1410. Thank you, Brandon. And Sonar, thanks for listening in too. Paul, now my dad was a little younger. He was born in 1936, but I know your dad served in the Navy. When did he get enlisted, or did he draft?
No, my dad enlisted in about 44 when he got out of high school. But actually 43. And, that brings up an important point. Did you know that on that day, 2,403 people were killed in Pearl Harbor, and 2,335 of them were military, and 68 of them were civilians. And alone on the Arizona, 1,177 people died, and there were 1,178 wounded. My dad joined the Navy, and so did my uncle joined the Army on my dad's side. And on my mother's side, my uncle Al joined the Navy, and my uncle Lenny joined the Army, and my uncle Gene was in the Far East, the Middle East, where he was in Egypt and in that area. So we've got a long tradition. And I actually have a friend, Mark Machuzik. He had 5 uncles that were in the military at that time. So, and that brings up another point. Within 30 days of the attack, 134,000 men and women enlisted. And that was prior to the draft even. So there was a great deal of patriotism in the country at that time. And it's really sad because there's very few of the World War II veterans that are left alive. And you know, in my opinion, all of them are heroes because they stood up for the country when nobody knew what was going to happen, and they went through a long 4 or 5 years of difficulty, and they really came through. And that's why they call them the greatest generation. And I found out something else that's interesting too.
Okay.
If you're a veteran of the Arizona, and any veteran that passes away has the right to be buried with his ship's comrades, and they will lay his ashes down on the Arizona still to this day.
Yeah, I've heard that happening. Now we got a call.
Yeah, we have Bob on the phone. He wants to join us here on the Chief Guard of the Republic. Good afternoon, Bob.
Hi, Bob.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Very interesting conversation. I was 10 years old when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor. I remember it very well. It was after church that it was before church that we got the news that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And I had uncles that served, one in the Navy, one in the Army. One of them was a doctor, and he volunteered. I don't think he ever shot anybody, but I think he certainly took care of a lot of wounded people. But I think the most interesting thing about this, and of course I've been listening to observations that you people have had concerning prior to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese intentions. Yamamoto is quoted very often because he was a very important admiral in the Japanese Navy, and he was very, very loyal to the emperor, of course, but he was very much concerned, having having gone to school in the United States and spent time here. He made many statements that were quoted about the folly of going to war with the United States. Once, of course, war was started, we declared war. The Japanese did not. They instigated it, sure as hell. But
well, there's official declaration of war on paper, and then there's actual declaration of war by dropping a bomb on your enemy. That's the first shot fired by one of those Japanese aircraft, or the first bomb. That was the official declaration of war.
Well, I think that they felt that they could cripple us so bad that we wouldn't want to go to war, and they would want to support them materially with raw materials that they need to conduct the wars that they already were engaged in.
Yeah, against the Chinese and the British and the French and the Dutch, and the Australian. Well, the Great Britain concluded.
I remember one quotation that Yamamoto made that stuck in my mind very well. He said, we can never conquer the United States because to do that you must occupy the land. And he said you could not occupy the land because there would be a patriot behind every blade of grass with a gun.
Yes. And one of the things talk about Yamamoto there, and Yamato's the ship, Yamamoto's the admiral. Now, he was kind of to the Japanese Navy, which was the strong arm, the Japanese fleet. Right. The admirals were kind of like in charge of anything. To the Japanese Navy, Yamamoto was like General Lee was to the Southern Army. All right. He was revered and everything. And Yamamoto knew that the politicians were pushing the emperor to go to war with the United States. So, and he had, like you said, he had been to the United States. He had seen the United States. He knew about our industrial might. He knew about our power, but he also knew that it was inevitable that the Japanese generals who hadn't seen this or anything, or didn't believe it, or believed in the invincibility of Japan, he knew that it was inevitable that they were going to convince the emperor to go to war with the United States. So he made the battle plan for Pearl Harbor and everything. And then he told them, either we do this my way, right? Because that's what he wanted. He wanted such a massive strike that we would come to the negotiating table and he wouldn't have to fight further. You know, just a kidney punch, the hardest kidney punch you could get, right? And so he threatened to resign. He says, if you don't let me do it my way, you know, it's like a kid. It's his ball. He's going to take it. You know, I'm going to resign. And then what would happen is, like, the fleet would be demoralized. You know, they would be, and they wouldn't go to war, or they would wait at such time as where the United States got dragged into the European war. And then because of the tripartite agreement, they would have to go to war with us without having that strike. And then maybe we would get the first strike against them, which in effect, we got, okay, they got Pearl Harbor first, right? And the Aleutian Islands and the Philippines were protectorates. Hawaii and Alaska were actually only territories of the United States, all right? They weren't states yet, all right? So they attacked the Aleutian Islands, they attacked Hawaii, they attacked the Philippines, they attacked Midway Island, which was, again, a protectorate of the United States, all right? And we struck the first blow against mainland Japan. So we sent the B-25s, the Doolittle raid. So that was
in April of 42.
April 42. So you look at April 4. Okay, so like we're talking about, my uncle was drafted out of Harrison High School in January of 42, a month after Pearl Harbor, because he was still in high school. He turned 18 years old, and they drafted him. He didn't even graduate high school, and he went up to the Aleutians to fight. So, yeah, so we struck the first blow against the actual Japanese mainland, all right? And without our aircraft carriers, which Yamamoto wanted to get rid of and didn't get rid of, we were able to do that. And we sent a message to the Japanese people that knew about the thing, right? That was going to happen. And what they did to the captured pilots, that's even more of a, it goes more to the crimes.
Brutal. It was a war crime.
Yeah, they considered it a war crime to attack their home country. All right.
There's another thing I think that should be mentioned, and that is that we were cognizant that the Japanese were rattling their sabers, so to speak, that they were building up and making threats and so on. And we were in the process of building up our strength.
Very slowly.
Yes, but we were sending, as a matter of fact, one of the reasons why the radar, which we had, although it was in its infancy, had detected a Japanese aircraft. But they were also expecting American bombers that had been coming over there.
There was a B-17 crew flight coming from California.
Yeah, wrong direction.
Yeah.
Coming from the wrong direction. They should have said, wait a second, these are coming from the east. Why would the B-17s been coming in from the east?
Probably their compass wasn't working too good.
Well, no one trusted it at the time, you know.
Right. Yeah, it was still relatively new.
You know, I was in military intelligence, and I can tell you we have some stuff. We could pick up a lot of stuff, but you can't even tell the bosses how you get that information. You're like, you just got to say, you got to believe me. And they're looking at me, right, with my nice thick Chicago accent, you know, and they're looking at me and say, why should we believe you? I go, I can't tell you, but it's gospel. This is going to happen.
You
right?
have to remember that the description Army intelligence is an oxymoron.
Well, yeah, I hear that a lot. Ha, ha, ha. You know, but you know what? It was also like military intelligence that broke the Japanese code.
You know, another thing we shouldn't overlook, though, is the fact that the Japanese were informing their embassy in like 14 separate telegrams that they weren't translating in time from the code. And they actually, you know, it could be viewed that they were going to tell the United States something, but because of the ineptitude or because of a happenstance or because of on purpose, they did not give the required notice that they were taking some action ahead of time so that civilians couldn't be killed.
They absolutely delayed it. That was absolutely intentional delay. one of the things in the I'm trying to think of this, the Geneva Conventions, right? I'm supposed to be an expert in that by my military job, is that if you're going to bombard a city, right, that you have to give fair notice to the civilians there that you got to get out, you know, because we're going to bombard you. That's in the Geneva Conventions. You can't just randomly bomb a city where you have to let the civilians know. And one of the things we had, you know, since Marconi was, even though we had international shortwave radio, you know, it could be on or whatever, but, you know, send across multiple frequencies, multiple transmitters, and it's going to get through. So if the U.S. Embassy, the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C., delivered late the declaration of war, right? Well, it was an ultimatum and then followed by a declaration of war to U.S. authorities. They could have simply sent out on the radio and said, listen, red alert, that's it, you know, that's it, everyone on high alert. Then you have a cap of 300 P-40s, which, the P-40, well, it's old. Well, Chinook proved that very effective against the Japanese before we entered the war.
In China, for sure, with Happy Boyington and all of them.
Well, yeah, he was there. You know, he was one of the Flying Tigers, all right, the American Volunteer Force. Yeah, so that P-40, 300 of them up in the air would have just, that would have been the end. The Japanese would have been splashed down,
turned around,
you know, 20, 40 miles before they even hit the island. And then you would have had those B-17s armed up, you know, to go out and find that Japanese fleet and drop bombs on them, you know. So it was intentionally delayed because even though, you know, you think they're going to telegram it, or you think they're going to, you know, send it, Washington's going to pick up a telephone, which the telephone lines really didn't go through. If you did something, it was like a shortwave link, right? So, yeah, it was delayed to ensure the surprise at Pearl Harbor. That was intentional, although they're going to say, oh, no, we fully intended to do it first. No, you didn't. You wanted plausible deniability.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Bob.
Yep.
You agree with that?
Do I agree with it? It's history.
I know it's written, but you know, sometimes history is interpreted. All right, people interpret history different ways. Yeah, I mean, the things we should have seen, you know, like I said, in 1930, you know, that wasn't the first time the Japanese attacked us. You know, they attacked us in 12th of December, 1937. So
in the gunboats.
4 years earlier, the USS Panay was a gunboat. And it was escorting oil tankers, all right, U.S. flagged oil tankers up the Yangtze River.
Right.
And they, was it the Yellow River or Yangtze?
I think it was maybe the Yalu.
Yalu, yeah. And the Japanese attacked them, even though the American flag, neutral flag at the time, right, was painted on the decks of all these ships. They still attacked them, and they go, oh, we didn't know. Plausible deniability. We could have been at war right then and there in 37, but again, we had an isolationist policy, and the Japanese said, "Oh, we're sorry," and they paid reparations. It's kind of like go back into I'm trying to think of it was 1936 when the Germans entered the Rhineland. All right, that was a violation of the Versailles Agreement. The war could have started, 1937, yeah. They entered the Rhineland. The war could have started right then and there. So same year, 1937. So if you don't think these guys were all collaborating, right, saying, we're gonna do some test missions here, all right? So the Japanese, you know, attacked this ship, and then they find that we kind of cared about it, right? But when the Germans entered the Rhineland, no one did anything. I mean, Poland mobilized to invade Germany because it was part of their tripartite agreement with the French and the British, that if the French had been attacked and entering the Rhineland was an attack against France, that they would come to their aid. But France never fired back at the Germans. Hitler said, hey, if the French fire one bullet at you, turn around, go back. We don't need this right now. So,
Bob, when you found out about it, did you hear about it on the radio, or was it a newspaper?
Radio.
just like here. We're radio.
Yeah.
It's awesome. And so, if you look, people should be looking at this stuff and going, hey, this is a poke at us. They're testing us, right? They're not afraid to attack us because no one in their right mind believes that they didn't see, right? They didn't see the U.S. flags on there, that they thought this was a Chinese gunboat with 3 Chinese oil tankers. No one believes that they thought that. It's going back to the USS Liberty, right? No one believes that they didn't think that was a U.S. ship. They were sending a message, a clear message.
It was a U.S. ship.
What?
But what they were trying to get across was, hey, you are aiding our enemy. So you are our enemy too if you're going to do that, and so we're going to shoot at you.
See, that's where that's the thing. That's the thing. They were taking a big gamble. They were taking a big gamble because if Reagan had been president at the time, there would have been a different thing. Because remember, Libya sent up aircraft against us, right?
Right.
And he shot him down, no problem. And when they had the Achille Laurel, right?
Yeah.
He had no problem punishing them for that stuff. No problem at all. All right, so, they take a chance and they poke the bear. Sometimes the bear stays asleep. Sometimes the bear wakes up and goes back to sleep. But then sometimes they poke him so hard that bear is never going to go to sleep. He's just going to wake up until he has eaten every bone.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, nobody wants somebody to push the button this time.
Oh no, that's hey, and we're getting a little off. We're getting a little off kilter from December 7th. But what I said is we should learn from this. We should absolutely learn from history. We should look at history because it repeats itself, and the only reason history repeats itself is one, because someone else studied history and decided this is tactics and this is the way you win a war. So if you see a guy's tactics and they're winning, right, then you repeat that. You don't do losing. You go with what works, right? And the other time is if you don't study history, it repeats itself because you don't know what's coming when you should have known because all the points lead up to it. 1, 2, and 3. If this happens, then that happens, then that happens, then you're at war.
All right. Well, one of the things that it's not something new, but it certainly is different than a declaration of war, and that is fighting battles through surrogates. Like Ukraine is fighting a war with Russia, and we're backing Ukraine, and we are giving them increasingly greater potential. We're escalating. Us and the Russians now are escalating.
Okay.
We're using supersonic missiles. They're threatening to use tactical nukes. That's not a good thing.
Okay, so here's where I don't want to do I really could do Ukraine and Russia right now, and I could go on forever because I was military intelligence. I actually trained in the Ukraine for a bit. I actually learned the Russian language, and I was a Cold War veteran. I mean, we studied the whole order of battle on that. And that's one thing. Yeah, there's always proxy wars out there. So yeah, it's a proxy war. You're trying to reignite the Cold War and everything. I agree with that. But World War II wasn't so much a proxy war. It was pretty much straight out, straight out. The Germans weren't using, maybe the Germans were using the Japanese against us, but they were both equal powers. You talk about Germany and Japan, they were both equally strong powers. And they didn't.
And relatively small countries.
Yes, but they mobilized. And okay, so like Japan, the ethnic Japanese, were superior. Did they use local forces? I'm not sure. But the Germans, however, they had the Wehrmacht and they had the foreign troops. So when Germany went to war, They had Germans, they had Czechs, they had Slovaks, they had Romanians, Hungarians, Bulgarians, Croatians. Those were all on their side and filling the numbers, and the Vichy France too, and then the Italians. So
And Austrians.
what the Austrians? Well, Germany had, yeah, the Austrians. They, and the Prussians from, so and the Lithuanians, and they started absorbing a lot that didn't like the Russians, and they were fighting with the Russians, so they did absorb large numbers of troops to kind of match the Russian numbers, but that doesn't match your ethnic, centralism. So the Soviet Union was still Soviet Union, so they were all central on that. So when we get back, more on we're almost done.
Yes, sir. It's the end of the show.
Oh my God, it goes so fast, man.
Went so fast.
I'll tell you, I have a great time. I hope you guys have a great time listening to me. And Bob, thank you so much for calling in. I hope you continue to listen to the show.
Always, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you.
Take care, Bob.
So see you next week on WRMN 1410 AM. You could also stream on WRMN1410.com. Call in on the studio number 847-931-1410. Text 505-926-1410. Or hit up on the Facebook Live channel WRMN 1410. And thank you very much for listening.
Jeff Michaels Show coming up next.
Everyone, have a great week.
Read some action-packed, exciting pulp fiction? Read the works of Michael Tooman, now featuring their internet.